Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Australian Wildlife Rehabilitation Conference Committee for having me come today and have a chat with you all. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what Wild Talk is and where it came from, what we've been hearing so far in the 18 months that we have been incorporated. I'm then going to talk a little bit about disenfranchised grief and then how you can access our services right at the very end. So first of all, I'd like to sort of just talk about how I started this in 2015 because I noticed amongst my other rescue cohort the amount of grief and loss and distress that was being caused by the animals, but nobody really talked about it. So I decided that as part of my private practice, I would start to allow people the opportunity to speak. But of course, once the fires happened in 2019, 2020, I got such a huge amount of response that we incorporated Wild Talk as a charity at the end of January 2020. We are offering counselling and debriefing. All of the counsellors that we have on board and psychotherapists, psychologists, social workers, mental health workers. We are all knowledgeable in the space of wildlife. We're also offering training, grants, and to date we've given out over $3,000 worth of grants and gift cards. And we're also a charity, so anything that is donated to us is tax deductible. With the training that we provide it with an emphasis on wildlife and wildlife workers. And we also, when we're allowed to do face-to-face training, we provide it in venues that are animal friendly and to things like feeding schedules and treatment schedules as well. So we don't stick to strict regimes. We basically say, we know you have animals, we're here for you. We are going to absolutely allow you to go off and feed your animals when you need to, and we're not going to get upset by it. So the counselling and debriefing services that we provide, they're available to anybody who works and volunteers with wildlife. So whether you're a wildlife volunteer, whether you're a rescuer, if you're working on the telephones, if you are doing anything to do with wildlife, conservation, research, working for an organisation that's working in that space, you are eligible to use Wild Talk services because essentially we are an employee assistance program for volunteers, but also for people who are employed as well, but working in that wildlife space and may not have access to an employee assistance program. So those of you that don't know, an employee assistance program is quite often offered within private organisations. It's a service that is paid for by the organisation and you get access to a number of sessions per annum. We're offering that as a service to volunteers and people working with wildlife. So what we've seen so far is this many people have called us. So on the map, you can see that the numbers that are in the brackets are the 6 months to the end of the financial year. And the numbers that are first are the numbers that we've had in the last financial year. So in the last financial year, we have done over 260 calls in New South Wales, over 180 calls in Victoria. We even had a call from Lord Howe Island, which was, I have to say, a little bit exciting because, you know, they tend to get forgotten, but they are absolutely a territory. So these are unique call numbers, and in total, 855 in the last financial year, and in the 6 months after incorporating, 258. The gender split of calls is generally 3 females to 1 male. So we are getting calls from men and women. 98% of the callers are still working and volunteering with wildlife, while 2% have decided that it's no longer for them because of the stress that's related to it. An interesting thing is that we're not actually getting calls about, we haven't really been getting calls about Black Summer since that first 2-week period between Christmas and New Year in 2019, 2020, because a lot of people aren't yet ready to talk about what happened. It's too distressing still. So we're just starting to get those calls now. Mostly our calls have been about day-to-day operations, roadside visits, getting possums out of chimneys, things like that. And as you can see, what we're actually seeing is the percentages of calls and the topics that we're talking about. Bullying and harassment within organisations and with each other. And I believe Howard Ralph referred to this earlier on about being kind to each other, because nearly 43% of our calls have been about bullying and harassment. Stress, trauma, nearly 29%. Grief and bereavement, 27%. So these are the typical topics that we're seeing coming through when we are actually taking calls from people. Now, unfortunately, we have also lost a number of wildlife people to suicide in the last 18 months. These are purely anecdotal numbers, because when somebody suicides, their primary occupation is recorded, not their volunteer status. These numbers, I'm aware of this number because people have called because a friend and colleague has suicided as a direct result of their work with wildlife. This number is obviously way too high. There are plenty of people out there who can support, including Two Green Threads and ourselves, Wild Talk. So we can support you if you are experiencing mental health issues, and we want to. Now, one of the most common types of grief that we are seeing is something called disenfranchised grief. Now, this might not be a term that you've ever heard before. So the majority of the rest of the presentation is around disenfranchised grief and what we can do to help prevent and avoid it in the future. But starting with what it is. So it's a term to describe grief that is not acknowledged as legitimate by society. Now, Kenneth Doker is pretty much the preeminent voice on disenfranchised grief. He's literally written the book on it. But I'm going to start by telling you a story. Okay, now this story may or may not be familiar to you, and I just would like you over the course of while I'm reading this to sort of like just think about and reflect a little bit internally. And remembering that I am going to be in a breakout session immediately after this, and you can call the 1300 number behind me at any time. So you have got plenty of support there for you. So this story that I'm going to tell you is kind of a composite of people, and so it may ring some bells. And I'm going to use the word work because clearly what we do is work, whether you are a volunteer or whether you're being paid to do it. So Jane has been working with wildlife for more than a decade. She started doing rescues, going out all hours of day and night, receiving calls via the hotline, the organisation hotline. Her first ever rescue was just hours after completing her basic orientation course. A kangaroo had been hit by a car. It was somewhat mobile, but clearly had a badly broken leg, and there was possibility of a joey in its pouch. Not being able to help this kangaroo alone, she called for backup, but there was none available. But it was clear that the kangaroo was going to need to be euthanized. Jane waited for nearly 2 hours with that roo, waiting for the police to arrive. They took several attempts to shoot the joey, and before applying the killing shot. Jane, who had never been around firearms before, was distressed, and the apparent lack of police care was quite concerning for her. She checked the pouch and found a joey, but it had bad injuries as well. She transferred it to a fabric pouch, stuffed it down her shirt, and took it to the vet for assessment. The joey needed to be euthanized. Not being sure what to do next, Jane let the vet take the joey from her, and she walked back to the car with empty arms. This was her first rescue. After arriving home, Jane got another call, this time on the other side of town, and it was a young male fence hanger. And by the time she got there, Its legs had almost been totally degloved, and it was so exhausted it clearly needed to be euthanized. This time an organisation shooter was able to help, and she went home with empty arms. She got home, she put dinner on, and she sat down and had a meal with her family. A week later, Jane was feeling empty, and after a big day of her day job, and after dinner with her family, which was her husband and 2 children, she sat on the sofa and cried. Her husband asked, "What's wrong?" When she told him she couldn't get the thoughts of the Joey and the Mama Joey out of her head, his response was, "Oh, that was a week ago. There'll be plenty of time to save some." Jane wiped the tears from her face, got up and cleaned up after dinner. Fast forward several years. Jane and her husband have moved to a property so they can set up a sanctuary. She's no longer doing rescues, but she is saving animals, and she is raising Joeys and releasing them on her property. They often come back to her for cuddles. Her kids are no longer enthusiastic. Her husband doesn't really help because it's all become too much. Jane keeps busy during the day, but the faces of the lost ones come to her at night. She often sleeps on the sofa in the lounge so that she doesn't wake her husband when she gets up to do the midnight pen clean or the feeds. She just keeps moving, and she openly admits, I don't have time to grieve. There's just too much to do. I'm wondering, and feel free to put messages, put notes in there, if anyone has if that resonates with anybody. Just take a moment. So disenfranchised grief is caused by the following 3 things. A relationship not being recognised, a loss not being recognised, or the griever not being recognised. Now, Brené Brown, who famously talks about vulnerability, also says we cannot selectively numb emotion. The same goes for our grief. Unacknowledged grief impacts our whole life. It's not just that small part of grieving. When we don't grieve, we can end up with disenfranchised grief and complicated grief. This is why we talk, and because we're not talking about it, we're not acknowledging it. Is any of this sounding familiar for you? Just take a moment to think, have I ever not acknowledged my grief? Have I not acknowledged my own part in my grief? In the cases of wildlife carers, we fall into all 3 categories, and we often do it to ourselves. The first thing is the relationship not being recognised. It's a wild animal. It's not there. It's not my place to get attached to this animal. Therefore, there is no relationship to grieve. We often do this for ourselves, to ourselves. And quite often organisations have the byline of we rescue, we rehabilitate, and we release. Where's the room in there for we care? The second is the loss not being recognised. Hearing the words, it's just a. For me, somebody saying it's just a snake is absolutely devastating because they're my absolute heart animal. That's not to say that I don't, have a lot of pleasure out of working with other animals as well. But people have said to me, "Oh, what are you worried about? It's just a brown snake." For me, brown snakes are absolutely everything, and every loss breaks my heart. If we care about an animal, regardless of its genus or its species, we care. So not recognizing the loss and not recognizing our connection to the animal is really, really quite important. So we need to be able to recognize that we are losing something, and something that is connected to us. If we lose a dog or a cat, people are much less likely to say, unless it's a cat, some people don't like them. But if we lose a family pet, people are more likely to empathize with us than if we lose a kangaroo or if we lose a possum or an echidna. It invalidates the loss. We need to have that loss validated and recognize that that loss is valid. And lastly, the griever not recognizing. Now, this is, again, comes back to that tagline, rescue, rehabilitate, release. When we use that, we're not putting any room in there for the connection between the animal and the carer. Where's the room in there for the care, the love, the attachment, the understanding of the animal? It's really important that when we acknowledge the griever, we can also acknowledge the loss. If we ourselves are not acknowledging our own grief, and we're not acknowledging that we have permission to grieve a lost animal, regardless of whether it's wild or not, how can we possibly allow ourselves to grieve? Now, we quite often do all three of these things to ourselves as a wildlife carer. Using myself as an example, I was a lizard and turtles and snake rehabilitator and rescuer. And I lost a lizard very, very shortly after I had gone and rescued it. It's just a lizard. I said that to myself. Stop it. It's just a blue tongue. I couldn't do anything for it. I need to get on with what I'm doing. I have done all three of those things to myself in my early days of rescue, even though I was a counsellor even at that time as well. So this is something that I'm quite passionate about, is getting carers to start recognising their relationship with their animals, start allowing themselves to recognise the loss of the animal, and start allowing themselves to grieve and acknowledge that they are somebody who cares about wildlife. It's literally the reason why you do what you do, because you care. So some of the ways that we can avoid disenfranchised grief from occurring. The first thing is to debrief. Now, debriefing is, I'm going to talk about each one of these individually. Debriefing is a very short term. It's when something is fresh. So when a trauma or an experience is fresh, usually happens within the first 48 hours to 72 hours. When we're talking about historical grief, the importance here is to recognize the grief and then to honor it and to honor the deceased. So when we look at debriefing, essentially debriefing is, tell me about it. Tell me your story. Tell me what has happened. This is a sense of reviewing or going over an experience or the actions that you have performed in order to give it some meaning and to give it some meaning making. It is generally a structured process that also allows you to evaluate your contribution to the success or the failure of the procedure that you have gone through, whether that be a rescue, whether it be a caring exercise. And again, as I said before, it generally happens within 48 to 72 hours of an event. This means that we can process through explanation and discussion of what happened. Now, there's some arguments as to whether debriefing, whether it's helpful. Traditionally, debriefing was operated in a military sense, and sometimes going into the absolute minutiae, tiniest detail of an event isn't necessarily helpful, because it can actually lead to more embedding of the events. So when we're talking about debriefing, we're talking about a very brief discussion, but facilitated and with the correct type of questioning and the right kind of direction. So there is an active participation that gives both and all people in the debriefing a voice. And the process looks something like this. So we'll come in to a debriefing and we look at, first of all, the facts. What happened during that thing? We then discuss the thoughts about what happened. So the thoughts and the emotions and the body sensations and the feelings. We look at the emotions that have been raised by that, and that can be historical emotions as well as recent ones. We then look at the signs and the symptoms of the distress that is being caused by that event. And we evaluate any potential for longer term problems such as disenfranchised grief, complicated grief, or post-traumatic stress. We also can implement any coping strategies in there with the in the discussion of with the client, and we will also do follow-up as well. Now, when we look at debriefing, we look at friends, families, colleagues, and a therapist. Now, friends, families, and colleagues are absolutely amazing and generally extremely supportive, but they're not always the best person to debrief with. And this is generally because they want the best outcome for you, and they might not be able to help you as impartially as a professional. So they may listen passively to your story. That's not helpful. It can instead embed that narrative that you've messed up, or you didn't do enough, or you made a mistake. They may ask too many questions or the wrong questions. Why didn't you do X? This can lead to, again, that narrative of, well, I didn't do it right. I didn't do the right thing. I should have done it better. I should have done this. They may overly empathize or sympathize with you, and this can lead to a circular narrative and can often further solidify the negative beliefs about your actions. And this circular narrative looks like, I didn't do it right. Oh, but I'm sure you did the right thing. Oh, but I could have done this. Yes, maybe you could have done that. Oh, but maybe I should have done this. Oh, well, actually, no, that sounds like you did the right thing. So you get into this negative narrative loop. And of course, there's also those who have no empathy or sympathy for what you're going through, because I've heard it all before. Debriefing with a therapeutic professional, they will be able to, you'll have the benefit of the empathy for the work that you're doing. And they'll also have the correct level of questioning and constructive discussion, because they are independent of you. Yes, they want the best for you, but they will also be led by what your desired outcome is. And again, as we discussed, debriefing is generally conducted within 48 to 72 hours of an event. It doesn't need to be a catastrophic or disastrous event. Okay, it can be that you've had a big day of taking kangaroos off the road and you're just feeling tired and you need to talk to somebody who will empathize and understand you. Personal experience here, I had a day one day when I was allowed to. I was driving back from Sydney to Canberra, and I pulled 27 animals off the side of the road from between Goulburn and between Canberra, and 27 animals, kangaroos and wombats. Unfortunately, none of the joeys that were present were viable. And by the time I got home, I just felt flat, empty, and awful. And I called somebody who I knew was going to be able to help debrief in a very constructive way. So it can be very, very helpful for you. So the next thing we can do, especially with historical grief, and I'm sure there are a number of you that may have historical grief that you haven't had time to grieve, is to recognize and process the grief. And coming back to good old Bruni, we cannot selectively numb emotion. So for grief that has been buried, recognizing it can be a very hard thing to do. When we numb sadness, anger, grief, hurt, we're also numbing happiness, joy, contentment, tenderness, and desire. This means that recognizing and allowing ourselves to process the grief, we can also allow ourselves to feel the good stuff without feeling guilt. I don't really have time to go into the guilt that wildlife carers feel, but I will be in the breakout session after this and every day this weekend. But I just want for a moment to take a moment of reflection. What's going on for you right now when you think about your grief? Is there anyone or anything or any animal that you haven't allowed yourself to grieve? And when you think of it, what happens in your body? Where do you feel it? Can you allow yourself to even think of those lost or the losses? Is it too difficult to go there? If you have a pen and paper, take a moment just to write down what has happened for you. When we recognize the grief, we allow ourselves to start processing it. Someone I'm working with has nearly 15 years of grief, and we're working through them one at a time. We're not flinging the door open and working through each and every one at once, because the lost that we lose each have a different impact on our life and the way we operate. When working with wildlife carers, it's not uncommon to see deceased family members not being grieved because they threaten to bring up all the animal losses in the person's life. So there's no room for any loss. So this comes back to that not numbing particular parts of us. Sadly, this vulnerability is all too common and is absolutely, it can be dealt with if you choose to. Like all therapeutic processes, there needs to be a desire to change, but also an understanding that it may get a little bit worse before it gets better, and that the relationship with the persons supporting you is absolutely vital to your success. With your therapeutic professional, if you choose to go down that path, or even with a family member, that you are getting support that is non-judgmental, independent, and understanding in every way. If you don't feel that you are got as a person, you're talking to somebody and they just don't feel like I've been got or understood, then it's possibly not going to be that helpful. And this is one of the reasons why we're quite often told by clients, I was wary about calling you because the last time I went and saw a counsellor, I was told to stop doing it if it causes me too much distress. I can absolutely guarantee that if you ever talk to a wild talk therapist, you will never be told to give up what you do. We understand that it is a lifestyle and it is a calling. And this is something that you are very passionate about. So once we've started the process of grieving, we can then start to honor the deceased. So honoring the deceased can be quite difficult, especially when we have many, many losses to grieve. So what are some ways that we can do that? So these are a few options, and you might have something that's personal to you too, but these are some of the things that we regularly talk to clients around, so that they can absolutely, start that grieving process. So build a cairn. So a cairn, for those you don't know, it's the old Celtic and Gaelic way of doing like road markings. So you'd build a pile of stones, and that would be a marker. They used to be used as direction markers, and they also used to be used as memorials as well. And they can be really pretty stunning. So if you ever do a Google search of cairns, you'll see some amazing structures that have been built as a cairn. It's basically a pile of rocks. Now, the way we talk about this is that if you're doing roadside rescues, or if you're doing raising of joeys and animals, or even going into things like firegrounds, picking up a stone and taking it and placing it into a cairn can be a great way of being able to memorialize those losses. Where you build your cairn, of course, is completely unique to you. I have one that happens to be probably about a 500-meter walk away from my house in a public park, but I walk my dog past it regularly. So whenever I walk past it, it's something that I see. You can build a meditation circle. If you are lucky enough to have property with lots of space, these are a great way to be able to memorialize your animals. And you can use the stones that you have collected, or you can get stones in specially to do it, to build. And this is what's actually pictured. So the idea is it's like a little bit of a maze. You walk through it slowly, and you use that time to reflect on the animals and the losses that you've experienced. You can keep a photo album. You can light a candle. Now, the important thing here with any memorialization and with any honoring is to the regularity of which you do it. If you're doing it every day, it's not necessarily that helpful. If you're doing it on a regular basis, such as on anniversaries, Christmas, public holidays, those sorts of things, we're actually talking more about an honoring and more of a funeral kind of memorial service rather than an obsession. So every day we're bordering into potentially complex grief because we're not actually letting go at all. Whereas if we're doing it on regular dates, such as holidays, anniversaries, things like that, then we're more into the healthier space of grief. But this is also not just about the animals and the losses. This is also about honoring your efforts as a carer. This is about honoring your commitment to the work that you do and the understanding that sometimes things go wrong and it's not necessarily or very rarely your fault. It's also about the love and the care that you display on a daily basis to these animals. And this can be an individual or a group process. So it can be something that can be done within your organizations. So just take a moment to think about what you might like to do to honor your animals and your losses, and to think about how you look after yourself as a carer and honor the work that you do. Okay, so what now? You know a little bit about disenfranchised grief, you know a little bit about grieving. I just want to let you know that Wild Talk is not just here for you in the capacity as of wildlife losses and wildlife trauma. We can help you with any of these topics and everything else that isn't listed as well. We are here for you with any mental health concern that you have. With our partner, Eudoxia, we have access to a network of 1,400 professionals that's made up of psychologists, counsellors, mental health nurses, social workers that understand the work that you do as a wildlife person. So we can help you with other things. You know, if you happen to be going through a separation, we can help you with that. The criteria for you calling us is purely that you work or volunteer with wildlife. So to access our services, you call the 1300 number. You can call it 24 hours a day. You can call it from any state or territory in Australia. You can access face-to-face, online or telephone sessions, and 6 are free of charge. However, one of the things that we have said is that as a volunteer assistance program, what we won't do in comparison to an employee assistance program is we will not cut you off at 6 sessions. We will continue your progress with the therapeutic professional that you have decided that you've built a relationship with for in response to making sure you get the best help that you can get. All we ask is that after 6 sessions, you make a donation to us, because we are not currently receiving any government funding, and we are completely funded by partnerships and private donations. And at this point, I would love to thank our primary sponsors, Chief Fluid Systems and the Humane Society International.